This episode of Love Larn is sponsored by Scott Bonnar Fabrication and Parts. I've got a couple of bearings to press today. This is the intermediate clutch assembly from the twin that I put back together yesterday. So it comes apart, that little bolt and washer, there's a nut that screws on the bottom end. And that sprocket lifts off the post. Normally you'd have your corks in there as well, the cork materials. I haven't installed those on this machine yet. This sprocket and plate are joined together and slip over this post. You can just see it, maybe there's a bearing inside this sort of cup that joins the two as well. Today I'm doing the same again for the 14-inch solids. So this is the adjustment bracket. It's a two-piece welded assembly. There's the flat bar with this post coming off of it perpendicular. You can see there's a little step to the post, and that's where this bearing sits that fits inside the cup of this half of the clutch plate. The decision then becomes, do we put it in here first or do we put it on the post first? For the twin, when I was doing this yesterday, I popped this on the post first and that worked quite well. So that's the approach I'm going to take again today. It's been suggested that putting that bearing into this cup first is maybe the way to go. And I can see how that would sort of make sense. It's going to probably be a little bit easier to get that bearing into this cup like so. I was able to push it on yesterday by hand, which was a little bit loose to my thinking. But if we got that in there and then line this up, could then use some force to drive that down onto the post. So I don't know, maybe we'll try it that way. The other task today is the reassembly of the large, I think it's the outer sprocket plate, and it's assembled. It's three pieces basically. So it's got the bearing cup on this large sprocket, a large bearing, I can't remember the exact dimensions of this bearing, but it's big, and this little center bushing thingo that sits in the middle of that bearing, which mates with the post on the adjustment bracket like so. Again, you can see the little roll pin in there if you're lucky, which engages with that slot. So I think what I'm going to do in this case, pop that into that bearing and then press the whole lot into this clutch plate. I'm going to be using some moly grease just to help things along, and also as an anti-seize, just in case this bearing ever needs to come back out. Got a long socket. It's not quite as wide as my bearings. I think ideally I'd prefer it be sitting on the outer steel of that bearing race instead of the little shield there. Just be careful with it. Ideally if you had a larger socket or a bearing press or something that you could manufacture to even out that pressure might be the way to go. The reason I'm using the socket is because I need to get that bearing seated on that lower raised section of this post. I need to press it down to about there. The other thing I've done in preparation for this exercise is just to give this shaft and the insides of these bearing cups just a light little sand, A, to remove some paint that was in there, but also just to clean up any burrs or anything that was going to interfere with those bearings slipping right in there. So at the moment I can't get those in there by hand. There is a trick which involves heating the component you're pressing into and freezing your bearing. So basically that makes the size of the bearing ever so slightly smaller to help it fit in there, and the other metal just a little bit larger, so it sort of all goes together, and then the temperature equalizes and everything goes back together the way it should. little bit of moly grease, a little bit of grey grease, just to coat the inside of this cup. So that bearing, just going to try and line that up just loosely by hand. It's sort of sitting in there, so hopefully we're aligned. You can see things squirming around a little bit, but that bearing is slipping right in there. I'm not using much force on the vise, a little bit now. That's the bearing in there. I'd like it sitting down a little bit further in there. What I might do is open up the vise a bit so I can get a socket on that. Just over that bearing. And try and close things up without everything going everywhere. There we go. Probably can't see that, but barely any pressure on that at all. It's pretty nice fit in there. There's a tiny little gap there. Could probably come down a little bit further on that, but I think that'll do for the moment. So the next step is going to be getting this in the right orientation on here, like so. So you can see again that's not going to fit without a little extra help. So for starters, I'll get a little bit more grease just around that collar, that sort of thicker section of the shaft, I guess it is. Again, just to help things slide home. Those two sections will now go together like so. I'm going to open this vise up just enough to slip that socket back over this post, and it's going to sit just on the edge of this plate here. So I'm going to pop that on top like that, sandwich it all together, and close the whole thing back up. Just going to get as far down into the vise as we can so that all that pressure is sort of within the confines of the jaw of the vise as much as possible. That's taking a little bit more effort to get that sucker in there, but it's going slowly. I just don't want to force it. Move on to our large intermediate sprocket. Again, that's the cup, bearing, and bushing. What I'm going to do first in this case is press those guys together. This has got a raised section as well, so I'm going to pop a little bit of grease on that raised section. Just a nice liberal coating. We can clean up whatever comes squirting out if it does. So as far as I know, these bearings don't have a specific side, whereas the bearings for the rear rollers of these machines do. That's going to pop in there like so, square as we can get it. I'll line the vise up. I'm going to drop that a little bit lower down. So that's bottomed out. Essentially, the I thought it got stuck, but because it started going in really smoothly and then kind of stopped. And what's happened is that bushings come out the bottom and it couldn't go any further. So same deal again. We'll get our little socket, which actually does match the inside race quite nicely on this bearing, being the bigger bearing, and just going to loosely align that as best I can, just eyeballing it, and continue pressing. Still taking a little bit of effort to get that home, but it's getting there. So that's now seated, that inner bushing is seated, tied up against the inner edge of that race. This guy's going to go in here like so. Again, what I'm going to do is get some grease on the inside this time. Again, with the goals being to help that bearing slide in there initially, and to keep it from adhering essentially to the inside of that cup should we ever want to remove it. I'm putting the long section in from the top here, so that it pokes through and hangs down on the inside. So I'm just going to get that sort of loosely lined up. This bearing feels like it's going to be a very tight fit on this one, so we might have to resort to some other tricks, but let's see how we go. Pop that in there. Probably have to get the socket on this one to complete the job, but let's see. Just going to rotate that around so I've got a nice even... You know, in hindsight, I can see that that inner bushing is, all of the force of the vise is pressing on that bushing rather than the bearing itself. So probably putting the bearing into that cup first would have been the better option. I've just popped some extra little blocks in here to sit either side of that, the edge of that sprocket, and it's popping home. That's our bearing. Sitting in there nicely. Got some grease coming through there, so I think we're in a nice tidy spot. You can see the top edge of that bearing is sitting just slightly proud of the actual cup itself. So that's about as good as it's going to get, I think. So I'm pretty happy with that. Spins, the outer sprocket fits on there. Whoops. Everything spins, that's spinning independently of the bottom half. The bearings are working how they're supposed to, so yeah.